Hello, and welcome to the Social Protection Podcast. I'm your host, Jo Sharp. As climate change, conflict and security, demographic and technological transformation dominate global agendas, my guests today make the case for going back to basics to fight hunger and extreme poverty. The Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty is a growing coalition now bringing together more than 100 countries, international organisations and financial institutions. Established in 2024 under Brazil's presidency of the G20, the Global Alliance and its policy basket of proven interventions, from cash transfers and school feeding to subsidised housing and support for smallholder farmers, is already shaping national strategies. Late last year, 5 countries launched fast-track implementation plans that mobilise and coordinate the expertise and financing needed to apply those solutions. And that's critical to respond to often highly fragmented donor support. And in this episode, we're talking about climate action. At COP30, the Alliance shepherded a landmark declaration saying that you can't talk about climate adaptation without talking about hunger, poverty and social protection. My guests today are Renato Domith Godinho, Director of the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty Support Mechanism, and Kevin Watkins, Visiting Professor at the London School of Economics. Welcome, Renato and Kevin.
Thank you, Joanne. As a regular listener to the Social Protection Podcast, I'm very glad to be here.
Thank you, Joanne. Great to be here with you.
Renato, the Global Alliance for Poverty and Hunger was established a year ago during Brazil's presidency of the G20. Can you start us off by telling us what is it, why was it established, and who are the members of the Global Alliance?
The Global Alliance started with a proposal by President Lula back in 2023 when the Indian presidency of the G20 was wrapping up. And he pushed that as a way to try and accelerate progress towards SDGs 1 and 2. Alongside other SDGs, they are falling behind, way behind what would be needed to meet the promises of the Sustainable Development Goals, 2030 Agenda. And there are basically 2 objectives for the Alliance on how to achieve that acceleration. So it's not bringing any new goals to the table. It's about trying to achieve the goals that are existing in the international community. And it tries to do that by first trying to keep the fight against poverty high in an international agenda that is becoming very distracted with many different issues: climate, conflicts, wars, security, communications, you name it. But if we can't manage to solve the very basics of fighting hunger and extreme poverty, how can we even hope to have a chance of solving those other, arguably more complex, difficult objectives? And the second is trying also to leverage that political will into a better coordinated, better synchronized environment to enable the countries and the governments are the ones that can really make an impact on fighting hunger and poverty, but enabling those countries to put in place large-scale, evidence-based programs against hunger and poverty, targeting the poorest, the most vulnerable. So the alliance was started in the G20, but it went much beyond the G20 now. So you asked about the membership. We have 103 countries plus the European Union, the African Union as members of the alliance, and many more international organizations, philanthropies, international financial institutions. So now I think it's counting on 203 members across these different constituencies.
Just staying with you for a little bit longer, can you give us a sense, in a nutshell, what are the interventions that you're looking at? What is the Global Alliance doing to help or work with countries to address poverty and hunger and accelerate the progress towards those SDGs?
So at its core, it has the concept of a policy basket. So it is a menu of options, of policies and programs that have proven to work quite well in different contexts. It is not a fixed instrument. It is a collective exercise from all the willing members to contribute to the conceptualization of the basket itself, its population, its refinement. So it is a living document. now it includes more than 40 policy instruments. We are talking about things like cash transfers, conditional or non-conditional, national school meals programs, or interventions to address specifically childhood poverty, or you can have subsidized housing programs for the poor or subsidized access to health. So there are a few inclusion criteria that anyone can submit one of those policies, including, do you have the necessary evidence for the program? Is it mainly addressing the needs of the poorest and most vulnerable? So if any submission meets those criteria, it can be included in the policy basket. So when an organization or a country joins the alliance, it produces and submits something called the statements of commitment. So they are committing to support countries in implementing policies under the basket. When it's time for implementation, countries can then request specifically the support of the alliance for helping with either some knowledge gaps that they have or financial gaps. And then a plan is put together on how to align different partnerships to apply for that particular program implementation.
Kevin, staying with the policy basket for a moment, as Renato's just said, up to around 40 different kinds of interventions that are already on that list. From your long experience working in international development, I'm interested in what you see as being some of those most effective interventions that countries can use and adapt to address poverty and hunger.
Thanks, Joanne. Maybe just to go back to where Renato started, the background to the formation of the alliance was a recognition, I think, that things, were not only way off track, because that was old news, but it was becoming more and more off track over the years. So if you take the extreme poverty numbers, for example, $3 a day poverty, where we now have around 800 million people living below that threshold. So that progress had started to slow before the pandemic. And the slowdown, if you like, intensified after the pandemic. And if you look at global hunger, the other big ticket issue for the alliance, really there's been no progress in global hunger for well over a decade. And again, that was also started to slow after the pandemic. And the thing about both of those slowdowns is there are a lot of complicated factors playing out. But in terms of the solutions, they're not actually all that complicated. So if people are living in extreme poverty, transferring cash or providing social protection to people who are in poverty or vulnerable or who are subject to health shocks and other shocks that they can't cope with, the policies are pretty obvious. And they're a central part of what Renato has described as the policy basket, the conditional and unconditional cash transfer programs. If you think of hunger, much of the worst hunger is playing out in low-income countries where the simple demography dictates that children below the age of 18, school-age children, figure very prominently. Now, it doesn't take rocket science to work out that school feeding programs are a really effective way of tackling childhood hunger in those countries. And again, school feeding programs have been a very central part of the policy basket and also of the plans that are being submitted by governments into the alliance. So, I think in a way the tragedy of this slowdown and the tragedy of the failure to deliver on the pledges that were made under the Sustainable Development Goals is both that we know what needs to happen, that what needs to happen is eminently affordable, even in the poorest countries with some international support, it's affordable. And it's deliverable because even in conflict-affected countries, low-income conflict-affected countries, you have safety net programs which have a demonstrated delivery and a strong evidence base to show that they work.
And we'll come back to that question of affordability and financing in a moment. Before we do, though, Renato, in November, we saw the first leaders' meeting of the Alliance in Doha. That was just ahead of the World Summit on Social Development. And at that meeting, Ethiopia, Haiti, Palestine, Kenya and Zambia all unveiled multi-partner implementation plans or fast-track plans. I'm interested to understand those plans a little bit more. Are you able to choose one or two and explain what's in the plan and how partners are supporting it. What does it mean to be on the fast track?
Yes, so the Fast Track Implementation Planning Initiative is what was launched by the Alliance's Board of Champions back in February. So I will pick the program from Kenya also because we have in our team a distribution of work where everyone has their roles, but they also are focal points for a particular country, like an account manager. So I'm the account manager for Kenya. And the program that they presented, Maji Plus, Maji in Swahili means water. So it is a very beautiful program, which I found very low-hanging fruit for what it costs on bringing water access to communities in the Asal regions of the country, the arid and semi-arid lands in Kenya. It is a large-scale program, so the idea is to get these solutions for water access to 1,400 schools in the whole country. Why pick schools? Because aside from the many powerful synergies in terms of learning, education, food security, nutritional values for those kids that will have access to this technology, they are also community centers, and the demonstration effect of these technologies implemented in the school can get others in the communities to then adopt them spontaneously as well. So this idea has been proposed by Kenya, and it was based on the successful pilots that were made there with some support from the Rockefeller Foundation and the government of Brazil, the WFP Center of Excellence, in building a few systems. So that is one of the kinds of technologies to be deployed under this program. They collect rainwater during the wet seasons so that it can be used throughout the dry seasons in those regions. And then the schools, in this case, will have access throughout the whole year. And these technologies, they were introduced in Brazil a while ago, I think 20 some years ago, in the arid regions of the northeast of the country. And it was extremely successful. The community was made much more resilient because of more than 2 million of those systems that were installed throughout Brazil in the northeast. So this is a program that also touches the keys of climate resilience. So we have managed to put together a partnership with the World Bank, the African Development Bank, whose then president in Seville announced $75 million for helping to fund this project. And now we are also initiating discussions with the Green Climate Fund that can also consider scaling up this proposal, and the partners that have helped with the pilot in Brazil as well, the Brazilian Cooperation Agency and the Social Development Ministry with the WFP Center of Excellence and the Rockefeller Foundation. They are putting together a knowledge packet alongside a larger pilot to train the trainer program so the systems can be built entirely with the workforce, the local communities, and the local materials available in Kenya. It's not about calling for a big international tender and having a company implement the systems and go away. So it has to be built locally with local knowledge so that it can grow organically and it won't depend on external maintenance and these things.
Thank you. It's a really interesting example and interesting to see how all of those different organisations and players have come together around this idea. Kevin, what's your sense of these fast track plans and this model or this way of working?
I think this approach is a really big positive step in the right direction. One of the things that we identified in the report that we prepared for the Alliance just before its foundation, one of the core themes that emerged was that there's a really high level of fragmentation in the delivery of support to countries. So, I mean, just to give you a couple of small examples, if you take a country like Ethiopia, it's typically managing contracts with over 400 different entities just in the domain of food security. Social protection is a little bit less fragmented, but it's still not uncommon to find governments dealing with dozens and dozens of different UN agencies who might be providing knowledge, financing agencies who might be providing financial support. Now, from the perspective of a government with very limited capacity, the transaction costs that come with that fragmentation are absolutely enormous. And in many cases, an additional problem is that the budget resources are typically allocated outside of the national budget through special donor-managed accounts. Now, but both of those approaches are really bad for national ownership. And I think what the alliance approach has done is provided, if you like, a platform for like-minded donors and knowledge providers to come together. We sometimes describe it as a sort of clearinghouse, if you like. And the advantage of coordination in the sort of context that Renato just described is it takes pressure off government. It means that the government plan itself is the focal point for delivery. It means that government systems are being used. And there are so many really good approaches and good policies around the world which are actually being undermined by weak coordination. What Renato has just set out for Kenya is really about supporting the national plan. And the other 5 programs, I can't remember all 5 of them, but we have programs on school feeding, which are working through national school feeding strategies. We have a food security program in Ethiopia, which is about building and supporting smallholder agriculture. We have a social protection program in Zambia, which is about building on a government plan to reach communities and constituencies that aren't currently being reached. And it's doing it without all of the transaction costs that would come with high levels of fragmentation. So I think this is exactly the right model. The challenge looking ahead is obviously going to be taking this to scale at the pace that it needs to happen. But I think perhaps we'll come on to that a bit later.
So, Kevin, staying with you, we come back to financing, of course, in this space time and time again. There are many lower income countries that don't have the revenue, domestic revenue, for example, to build national social protection systems with the coverage they would really need to reach all the people who need it, for example. What are the options you see for, I guess, more financing or perhaps better coordinating available financing of social protection and some of these kinds of initiatives in lower income countries especially?
Well, you're right that there are very serious financing gaps in this area. If memory serves, the last ILO report on the state of social protection systems around the world, I think it estimated that establishing a universal social floor, obviously covering quite a wide range of areas from health, pension-related, employment-related interventions, as well as safety nets. But the cost of providing that is roughly equivalent to 50% of the GDP of low-income countries. Now, that number goes down a lot for lower middle-income countries, obviously because they have a much bigger revenue base and a larger economic base, but it's still around 3 to 4% of GDP on average. And I think it pretty much goes without saying that if you look at the financing landscape, you really need 2 things. You need governments mobilizing more resources, more investment to put into social protection systems, but also the international community needs to step up and do more. You know, there's really no point signing up for ambitious sustainable development goals or making ambitious pledges at the Financing for Development conference, and then the international community turning its back and saying we have fiscal difficulties in the north. And of course, one of the problems that we have right now is these very deep cuts in aid that are already coming on stream, are already starting to affect social protection systems, social assistance mechanisms in many countries around the world. So it seems to me that the recovery package has to include 3 things, which is creating an enabling environment for governments themselves to do more. And that can mean debt relief as one of the mechanisms that could be used. But it also means governments themselves mobilizing the revenue, spending it efficiently, targeting it effectively on the poorest communities. That's really important. secondly, we need to see the donor community rethinking these aid cuts. These are tremendously damaging cuts. They're happening both with respect to humanitarian aid, which is actually a significant source of financing for safety net programs in many of the poorest countries. But it's also happening with long-term development assistance. And that's clearly the opposite of what we need right now. And thirdly, it's obviously critical that we get the most out of every single dollar that is allocated. And that means operating in ways that don't involve high levels of fragmentation, that don't impose high transaction costs on developing country governments, and that coordinate donor efforts effectively. If you looked at the health sector, you have multilateral mechanisms like Gavi and the Global Fund for Fighting HIV, AIDS, Malaria, and Tuberculosis, which are already really effectively coordinating the donor effort. And the donors are committing finance in advance to those funds. My own view is that we need to see something along those lines for the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, which I think is really well placed to provide a vehicle for efficient and equitable delivery.
It's interesting you raised that. My most recent interview was with Olivier de Schutter, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. And of course, he's also been talking about a kind of a global fund model for social protection for some time. Renato, you've recently been appointed the director of the support mechanism for the Global Alliance, which, as you mentioned, is now kind of operational after the first year. Just briefly, what's that support mechanism role? How do you see the support mechanism functioning?
Yeah, let me start by first spelling out what the support mechanism isn't. So from the beginning, it was decided that the support mechanism of the alliance, they won't be a fund or integrate a fund, because if part of the diagnosis in that report that Kevin worked on, part of the problem is the fragmentation. So the solution isn't to add to the fragmentation by building another specific fund that will compete with existing funds for the ever scarcer international resources. So it doesn't do that. What it does is to try and align the knowledge and financial resources from the members. So the members of the alliance are the real weight and strength behind the alliance, and the support mechanism is the one connecting the dots. So the support mechanism is a small team distributed among some hubs in Rome, where it is having its headquarters, but Brasilia in Brazil, in the south, Addis Ababa for African liaison. There is another regional liaison planned for Bangkok, for Asia, and one in Washington, D.C. for basically liaising with the international finance institution. So the support mechanism is doing this concentrated work, focusing on the countries and leveraging the partners, but also supporting the alliance's governance. So the alliance has a board of champions that includes up to 25 member countries and 25 of the non-countries. So the international organizations, finance institutions, philanthropies, they are high-level policymakers in those institutions and countries that can be tapped by the support mechanism, but they also can be tapped on to maybe remove some specific roadblocks. And the support mechanism is the one trying to connect all the dots between the 200 members for support implementation and helping to leverage each one's strengths to untie these knots and bring the activities to existence.
It sounds like you have your work cut out for you. Kevin, there have been various efforts around, for example, the Global Accelerator for Jobs and Social Protection and some of those kinds of structures and mechanisms that are, I guess, in similar ways trying to coordinate and leverage funding for some of these aims. After a year of Global Alliance's operations, do you see it to be substantively different, particularly promising or innovative in some way?
Well, I think it's a different complementary model. So the Global Accelerator is doing really important work, providing technical advice to government. It's a network. It's playing an important advocacy role. And there are other mechanisms that are doing that as well, the Social Protection Floor Initiative and all of that sort of thing. I think what's different about the Global Alliance is the model. And, Renato rightly said that when it was created, it wasn't envisaged that the Global Alliance was going to become like the equivalent of a global fund of the type that Gavi is. But the global funds in health do a number of things which aren't just about money, actually. So they provide exactly what you were talking about before, which is a vehicle for coordination. Now, in the case of the Alliance, I think it's very clear in social protection. I haven't yet had chance to listen to your interview with Olivier yet. And, he's been making some really important points about the financing gap in social protection. I think the challenge is that debate about a global fund for social protection has been going on now for well over a decade. And in the current climate, there is no strong international impetus for support in this area. Actually, really the opposite. And my view is that if you have a mechanism like the Global Alliance that's there, it already exists. It's a structure in which actors in the global south have a really strong voice. It's a structure in which all of the major donors for social protection are already there. And my view is that there are ways of working through the alliance that wouldn't entail a transfer of funds to the alliance. It wouldn't entail the alliance becoming a new financing mechanism, but it would exploit the enormous potential that the alliance has already demonstrated to bring donors and knowledge providers together in support of national programs in a really effective way. One of the versions of this model could be that the major donors would indicate in advance the level of financing that they would be willing to provide for plans which are submitted. You're going to get a greater impact for the resources that you put in.
Renato, Brazil also hosted COP30 in 2025, a great opportunity to highlight the links between combating poverty and hunger and responding to climate change. Of course, the role of social protection in those endeavours is key. What did the Alliance advocate for at COP30?
The Alliance helped to cook specifically the Board of Champions, what was adopted in the leaders' meeting of the COP30. So like a few days before COP30, which we think is a landmark declaration on the space of social protection and climate. It's called the Belém Declaration on Hunger, Poverty, and Human-Centered Climate Action. So it is a recognition adopted by the leaders of, I think, almost 50 countries. It is not part of the formal COP negotiations, but the political commitment by many of the key participants there, ranging, by the way, from China to the UK, to Brazil, to Ethiopia, and several other countries, which I think has a broad and diverse array of countries endorsing this declaration. So basically those three areas, they should be central to climate action. They should be central to adaptation. And they are also ways to promote a just climate transition. So there was, I think, up until today, a lack of attention to these aspects in climate financing. So I think the same report that we discussed that Kevin have helped draft was highlighting the fact, and this is widely known, that less than 1% of climate finance going into agriculture, less than 1% reaches the real smallholder producer, and not much of the climate finance right now looks at social protection as something related to climate adaptation. So it is not just about building infrastructure or resilient infrastructure or changing building codes. You have to look at the people. It's human-centered climate action because those that are most vulnerable and least responsible for climate change are also the ones most exposed to the impacts of climate change. So it is about recognizing this and providing the instruments, the adaptive social protection systems, crop insurance for these vulnerable communities. So also those that are most vulnerable and to poverty and to climate change happen to be also those that are producing food for the countries, although they should be also part of the solution. So the declaration builds this case and also tries to look at some quantifiable objectives, although we didn't have specific targets to be met, but quantifiable objectives that can be measured against progress on, for instance, things like how many countries are including social protection in their nationally determined contributions, their adaptation plans and other plans, or how is the share of climate financing that is reaching social protection or including mechanisms such as subsidized crop insurance, harvest insurance, or other means to build resiliency for the poorest and most vulnerable there.
Kevin, I thought Renato made a great point up front saying that it's important to go back to basics and make sure that poverty and hunger remain on the agenda. But of course, as we've also just heard, this is all in the context of a changing climate that is only going to make that get harder. What are your own reflections on, I guess, the challenges and opportunities ahead?
I think the Belém Declaration has addressed head-on what is a major concern in climate finance. So the countries and the communities that are most exposed to the climate crisis, in particular low-income countries, in particular those that are affected by fragility and conflict and violence, are precisely those with the lowest levels of coverage. There's actually a report that we've recently completed for ODI Global, which makes the point that the average level of social protection in countries which are marked by really acute climate vulnerability and fragility and conflict, in other words, these overlapping dimensions of vulnerability, if you like, that the current coverage is under 10%. And if you look at where the risks are that come with climate variability, the risks of drought, of uncertain rainfall, they clearly fall most heavily on smallholder agriculture, especially in parts of the world like sub-Saharan Africa, where irrigation is very limited. So, when you think of where we most urgently need to accelerate the expanded coverage of social protection systems, it's precisely those countries. And what's often, I think, been missed in the past is that when these international targets are set, there's very little attention to which countries and which communities we're talking about. And the result is that a lot of countries, the ones that I've mentioned, and a lot of communities, notably the poor, have been left behind. And they've especially been left behind in the domain of climate finance. There's almost no climate adaptation finance, which is currently directed to social protection. And that is just a massive missed opportunity. But it's also fundamentally inequitable because, I've had an opportunity to work in Somalia, just to give one example. And one of the things that will typically happen in Somalia, even with a moderately extended drought, is that families are forced to sell off their assets. They're forced to take children out of school. They're forced to reduce consumption of healthy foods, all of which have terrible long-term consequences, and all of which add to the cost of humanitarian aid further down the line. So the smart thing to do would be to invest in advance in the social protection systems that can respond when these crises happen, rather than waiting to deliver after the event, which is, inefficient and not particularly helpful.
Kevin, Renato, thank you so much for joining me on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thank you, Joanne, for having us.
Thank you, Joanne. It's been a pleasure.
Before we go, we like to end each episode with some quick wins. We ask our guest to bring in some recommendations for events, news, research that have sparked their interest and that we think you should know more about. Joining us for Quick Wins today is Raphael Dutot, Manager AI and Data Ethics at Employment and Social Development Canada. Welcome, Raphael.
Hey, Jill. How are you doing today?
Very well, thank you. So I'm very excited to speak to you as somebody who's at the heart of thinking in your department about AI, data ethics and their use in social protection. Let me start off by asking you, can you tell me something that excites you about the opportunities for AI in social protection?
Oh, for sure. They are so many. I mean, artificial intelligence is a change of paradigm. I often like to present the technology as a methodology, not only a technology. So in the past, when we were trying to determine, for example, if there's a cup in the picture, if you were to take a picture of me holding a cup, you would realize that the best way to do it is to modelize the cup in 3D and try to find if there's a cluster of pixels that match this modelization. But to do this, you need someone who understands the essence of the cup, who's going to be able to modelize it to represent all cup. While with artificial intelligence, what we can do is simply take a million pictures where some have cup, some don't have cup, and feed it to a very adaptive algorithm that's going to learn to predict that there's a cup in this picture. And the big change of paradigm there is that you can now, rather than having to define everything, you can learn from example. And social protection agency are a custodian of an enormous amount of data. And what AI does is that it brings us the capacity of harnessing the power of that data. So, for example, in ESDC, where I work, one of the programs we have is Reaching All Canadians, where we try to identify Canadians that should have uptake a benefit but did not, and understand why. With artificial intelligence, we're going to be able to push this program much further than what it is right now, being able to identify specific cluster of people that have not uptaken that services, and probably because we didn't provide an easy way for them to uptake that benefit. We can talk about OCR, optical character recognition. So one of the things that is very difficult in social protection agency is that we still receive an enormous amount of paper form, which takes a lot of data entry power. So rather now than having to rely on manual work and data entry, we can use optical character recognition to implement these forms directly and then deliver the benefit based on the information on these forms. And all of this is possible because of artificial intelligence. So when it comes to the benefit for social protection, they are numerous. If I look a little bit forward, we're living in a time of great disruption. And with the tariff coming in, with the change in technology, we're seeing a lot of work displacement. And the ability from a labor perspective to try to match those workers who are going to be unemployed with those new opportunities that are coming up is something that AI can help tremendously with. Looking at their resume and try to pair them with the best opportunity possible, it would be impossible for a worker to look at all the opportunities and all the workers and trying to match them. But with using artificial intelligence, we can create this pairing, these cluster to provide the best opportunity to the most fitted work. So this is an area of great potential in my mind.
Thank you. I thought that comment about mythology and technologies is a really interesting way of thinking about it. And I appreciated you highlighting particularly the opportunities for inclusion and to improve coverage and reach as one of those opportunities, along with, finding those efficiencies. And also, it's interesting thinking about the challenges that will come for the workforce with the adoption of AI, but perhaps AI helping to kind of do that labour matching down the track, let's hope. So I guess that leads me to the next question. What are some of the things that worry you or even scare you about this brave new world we seem to be entering?
It's the flip side of the coin. The big advantage of artificial intelligence is that we no longer need to be expert in the field in order to do modelization and predict something. The danger with that is that we are at risk of not understanding where is the prediction coming from. In the jargon we generally refer to this as low explainability. And generally, the more powerful your model is, the less explainable it is. So the harder it is to try to understand why it made that prediction or this other prediction. And when you combine this with the fact that there's often bias in our data, you can find yourself in a position where your model is going to predict 99% of things accurately, but the 1% it misses, for example, in Canada, all First Nation people. So you end up with a model that is extremely accurate, yet extremely discriminative at the same time. And this is generally referred to as a fairness issue in artificial intelligence. And the problem is that often we are under the impression that, you can just assess this easily. Just look if your model is performing equally for everyone. The thing is that when people do these kinds of modelization, they don't necessarily have access to this information. And the model doesn't learn, this is someone from, for example, First Nation group that's discriminate against it. It's more intrinsic than that. There's going to be a variable, there's going to be a proxy that's going to lead to this. And through this proxy, the model is going to learn to discriminate, which as the last thing we want from a social protection standpoint, because the purpose of our agencies is to try to help everyone, not to entrench past biases and discrimination into algorithms. The biggest problem I see with artificial intelligence, and contrary to past technology, the fact that artificial intelligence is so accurate yet so difficult to understand how it came to a specific prediction, renders these risks much, much more present than they ever was. And the thing on which they pick are much more likely to be related to social component, which leads to not only bias, but social bias. And this is by far the aspect of artificial intelligence that scares me the most.
Thank you. That's so interesting. It makes me think a few things, but you talked about the characteristic of that sort of AI analysis, and I would maybe add that AI feels very plausible, or at least the way I interact with it. It looks like it should be correct, and it does take expertise, as you're saying, to be able to interrogate it and check, let alone, as you say, understand how it has reached the conclusions it has reached. It is, after all, out of a machine learning kind of algorithm that we're seeing, producing all kinds of interesting results that may, in fact, be unexpected. So really important, as you say, to call out the risks around bias. With that in mind, and that set of challenges that you've highlighted, particularly for departments like yours, can you tell me a little bit about the AI Hub that was recently launched under the Digital Convergence Initiative, and why Canada and your department, especially Employment and Social Development Canada, is lending support?
This is such an interesting question. The AI Hub for Social Protection is a fantastic initiative that aims to try to help social organizations across the world to better up their strategy in order to use artificial intelligence, govern, and collaborate. Let me give you an example. We're talking about fairness issues. My group developed what we call a fairness assessment service, which allows us to bring auxiliary data, pair it with the result of the model, validate the performance of the model across a broad range of different groups. And through these kinds of exercise in the past, we've identified, for example, that one model that was to be deployed was discriminating against a specific group of Canadians, and we were able to correct this problem before deployment, avoiding these kinds of risks. Setting up this kind of environment is extremely difficult. It's a social technical thing because not only do you need the expertise to do the linkage, not only do you need the know-how on fairness and statistical definition, but you also need to have data that you have access to and that you're legally allowed to pair with these things. And if we could do it all over again, the regulation we have that date back from the 80s, for example, we would make sure that they include these kinds of potential assessment in them to avoid creating these kinds of barriers. And this is a little bit what I'm hoping that we're going to be able to do with the AI for social protection. We're going to be able to help countries developing their AI strategy, for example, to make sure that they include these kinds of provision in their regulation so that they can take advantage of these data while adding methodology to mitigate the risk that comes with them. It's also a possibility to share across countries. For example, we were talking about OCR. There's very few OCR models that are currently available that have been developed specifically for social protection. And our form are constantly changing. They're very specific. So when a country develops them, after that, one thing that is fantastic is that it can be shared. And if we create these kinds of digital public good that people can use throughout the world, the quality of these frameworks are going to evolve to match our need in a very interesting fashion. And same thing for chatbot. And the needs of countries across the world when it comes to social protection are often similar. Think about floods, for example. How do we react to floods and how do we help people? We all base ourselves on satellite data. So there's a lot that can be done there that can be reused elsewhere, which is fascinating. And it's also egotistical a little bit. There's a lot of knowledge creation and sharing. Yes, Canada is contributing to this exercise, and we're more than happy to bring our experience and our failure to the table to make sure that they are not reproduced. But we're going to be able to gain from the failures of others as well. It's a very young field, and governing artificial intelligence is something quite difficult. So having the ability to do it together in the specific context of social protection is such an incredible opportunity for everyone at the table.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it is such a young field, isn't it? It's hard to believe that it's really only in the last few years that these tools have become so ubiquitous, in so many different settings. And I guess that challenge for countries that are setting up their systems and still grappling with these questions of who's eligible, how do we identify people who should be eligible for whatever benefits are available, and some of those things. You know, as you say, that the kind of the efficiencies that offered by AI are so exciting, and yet, you know, to be grappling with these challenges alongside that even greater task of just setting up the system or expanding the system, it compounds the challenge in a way. So for listeners, we will put a link to the AI Hub, which sits under the USB 2030 Digital Convergence Initiative. A shout out to the Digital Convergence Initiative, which really is the most incredible repository of information, particularly on these issues around systems and interoperability and MIS, with a lot of really great knowledge exchange between lower and middle income countries, but also higher income countries like Canada in the mix as well. And the AI Hub was recently launched via a webinar, which we can also link to on socialprotection.org. Raphael Duteau, thank you so much for joining me on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for listening to the Social Protection Podcast, brought to you by socialprotection.org. You can find all of our episodes on the socialprotection.org website and on your favourite podcast platforms. Be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review. Back next month. See you then.